Australia has become the first country to ban social media for children under the age of 16. From this week, 10 major platforms, including TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, have been ordered to prevent children from accessing their services or face fines of up to $33 million. The new law has drawn criticism from major technology companies and free speech advocates, but it has been welcomed by many parents and child welfare groups. I'm now joined by Robin Wolfson-Foster, who is a child protection activist and writer from The Voiceless. Robin, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this morning. Quite interesting. So Australia now having banned social media use for those that are under 16. How do you assess the effectiveness of this legal approach?
Well, good morning, Katlego, and good morning to your viewers. I think that the effectiveness will be something which we'll have to monitor over time, but there are some incredibly sound and robust academic studies that have gone into recommending that we should not be allowing children under the age of 16 to access social media. And I think that although there is some debate, as you mentioned, and in fact there are already some legal actions that have been taken against the Australian government as a result of this, the overwhelming evidence is seeming to point to that the harms outweigh any valid and useful input from social media for under 16s.
Let's talk about those harms. I mean, from the experiences that you have in terms of working with children and protecting their rights, what are you seeing as really some of the highlights of what social media has done to young children in terms of that access and how they view the world?
Well, I think part of the problem is that there is this enormous fight between tech companies for users. So they are not necessarily building ethical constraints into their tech. So they're developing very quickly. And often what we're doing is retrospectively, we're going back and saying, okay, well, this created some harm, but then it's too late. So some of the biggest ones that we're seeing is average age of first exposure to pornography amongst children is around the age of 10. We're also seeing children exposed to incredibly violent content. When I do workshops with children, one of the things I ask them is, do they know who Charlie Kirk is? And inevitably, more than 50% of them saw him being murdered, and that is through social media. They also are exposed to incredible harms through online bullying, through violent gaming. We also have a huge problem amongst teens with online gambling. So there are many different things. And then that's before we even talk about the mental health issues associated with body image, associated with the kind of hate speech that we see online. And also children, their brains haven't finished growing yet. So for many of them, they find it very difficult to work out what is real information and what is disinformation. And so what we find is that the perpetuation of stereotypes and harms is being actually channeled through social media. So there is a lot of concern about it.
I can imagine, and I mean, you and I were speaking just before the interview with regards to then the role and the responsibility of parents and them being the ones to police whether their children have access to some of this. And you were saying as well, quite a big battle for parents, especially if they're working up against such big tech companies.
Exactly. It really isn't a fair fight. So in South Africa, we have put the onus on education in order to create a situation where children are kept safe. But that really isn't a fair battle because they are battling against billion-dollar-a-year industries and hugely competent algorithms that are designed to keep them online for as long as possible. So we can tell children to keep themselves safe, but in fact, there is a requirement that both big tech and then governments get on board in order to help them. Because a lot of our parents actually are not tech savvy. So here's the problem is our children are tech natives. Yeah. We're tech tourists. You know, we are definitely, we visit and we don't have the competency to be able to always know what children are doing online. But just because our children know what they're doing online doesn't mean that it's actually good for them or safe for them.
So, I mean, then it speaks to some of those legal challenges that social media companies and parents even might pose with regards to this ban. How do you think this will then affect the implementation and the longevity, particularly for Australia and many other countries that are looking to take this route?
I think that the legal challenges were inevitable because this will cost a lot in terms of revenue for tech companies. So they were going to take them on. And there are also some children, in fact, who've got involved in this, which I think is interesting, because one of the things that we have to do is we've got to do this with children and not to children. Yes. So I think that is really important. However, it seems that Australia is very committed, and they've rolled it out quite quickly. This has come in the space of about a year that they have done all of the legislation and the regulations around this. So it will be an iterative process. But I think what we've got to say is, if there is a groundswell of other countries joining in this initiative, then eventually it will become not valid for tech companies to take this to court, because they will actually see that, in fact, they're fighting a losing battle. And what's frustrating, I think, for us is that we can see through the Australian case that tech companies have always had the age verification technology in order to work out how old children are, and yet they haven't used it. So it's taken something like this for them to have to do it. And in fact, they could be now proactively saying, well, we're going to roll it out as a measure of good faith. We're going to roll it out across other countries because we can see that this would be beneficial. However, it would have to take all of them in order to do it, because, you know, if one company did that, then they would risk losing all these users who in many cases are as young as 8. Sure. Starting on social media platforms. So by the time they're 16, they've already spent half their life on social media, which is something we should be very concerned about.
This is very scary, but do you think this is a fight that South Africa might want to join in on?
Oh, I would love to say yes. Unfortunately, we are very slow in the uptake of this. And we have signed the Bogota Convention, which committed us to combating digital harms. That was last year. And what was really interesting about that was that some of the countries actually committed to legislation. South Africa committed to education, which is good, but disappointing, because actually the Law Reform Commission has done a lot of work around changing our legislation to keep children safer online. And unfortunately, that work has been sitting gathering dust for years. So it's never made it to Parliament, and we are already so far behind the curve. So I think what we've got to say is there's some interesting conversations that have been happening, especially recently during the G20 Social Summit. Government met with the Brave movement, and it looks like there's some real thinking around what we could do better. But we should have started a long time ago, and now we are playing catch up. And unfortunately, technology keeps on changing and moving, and unless we move swiftly, we are going to constantly be left behind.
Do you think there are any psychological impacts on removing the young users on social media, particularly when it comes to how they use the internet, also maybe just to study? You and I would have used encyclopedias back in our day,
right,
but many use YouTube in today's times in terms of them trying to access certain information. What would be the negative impact of then having these young children removed of social media?
So I think there are a couple of things, and certainly you could still use YouTube, for example, in a school setting.
Yes,
you could have a teacher who could Google something, and then you could watch a video together. The issue is around individual and its unrestricted use by children. And just to say, as a caveat, which is really important, is the onus is completely on the tech companies to keep children off social media. There is no penalty at all for children for being on social media. But I think that there are some learning concerns, and it's something that we've got to work on.
Yeah.
Bigger concerns might be around social networks, particularly for vulnerable children that maybe have found a tribe online, and that might be quite concerning. But I do think that even with that, we have to say that the benefits for those children of being online are probably still outweighed by the harms.
You mentioned that the onus is on the tech companies to ensure that the young users are not using their platforms. Do you think that teenagers are going to find ways to circumvent some of these restrictions? Probably.
And I think this is the problem, is that unless there's buy-in from the children, then they are going to find ways around. And in fact, if you look at the UK, they're looking at things like VPNs for this reason, because they know that children are very clever at circumventing restrictions. However, again, this comes down to groundswell. if none of your friends are on social media before the age of 16, then maybe it will be easier for children to really go back to some of the things which were endemic to childhood before the age of social media. So the climbing trees, the riding our bikes, the hanging out together, the reading books, the exciting things that actually are part of childhood that we're not seeing so much anymore.
Lastly, Robin, I mean, just some of those additional legal or policy measures that you would recommend, especially for South Africa, for us to find our way ahead of the usage of social media, especially for those that are under the age of 16.
So social media should definitely be something that should be on government's radar, and the recommendation is definitely 16. There are some disputes about that, but I would say 16 is a good benchmark. We also need to look at ways of cutting children's exposure to pornography and violent online gaming and other harms that are coming through that. And there's some good thinking and good work that has been done around that. So government literally just needs to come to the party and implement it.
All right, maybe a very long road, but one that's certainly one that we should all be willing to take. But thank you so much for your time and for your insights.